Hello, everybody. My name is Luke Menzel. I'm CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's webinar on mandatory embodied carbon policies being hosted by the Energy Efficiency Council with the support of the Australian Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. I'm here to make some introductory remarks, and then I'll hand over to Ivana Brown, Head of Operations and Standards at NABERS, the National Australian Built Environment Rating System, to facilitate the rest of the evening's presentations. We're at a really exciting moment in the evolution and sophistication of, I guess, how we're thinking about emissions and carbon as it relates to the building sector. As many of you would know, much of our focus for many years now has been on operational emissions. That remains incredibly important, and we continue to make our best efforts to drive those emissions down, supported obviously by the great strides that are taking place in the rollout of renewables and our electricity sector. A focus on on-site emissions generated from burning fossil gas remains a challenge in Australia and many countries around the world. The shoulder is absolutely to the wheel on that front, but simultaneously, we're looking to another very significant source of emissions, embodied emissions, which are the emissions that are tied up with the materials, construction, and the associated practices that are bound up with the creation of buildings, both in the residential and the commercial sector. IEA analysis has found that these emissions make up as much as 10% of global emissions, so very significant, something that we really need to think about. And as we drive down operational emissions, embodied carbon becomes an ever increasing proportion of the overall emissions from the building sector. So something that we need to start work on now to make sure that we can ensure that that part of the building sector is making its contribution to the journey to net zero emissions. Noting, of course, that requires deep engagement with our friends in the building product sector, in the manufacturing sector. Embodied carbon is another way of saying industrial decarbonisation. And so we need to think about those two policy areas in a joined up way. And increasingly that's happening around the world, which is incredibly exciting. We're going to kick off this webinar by launching a report which has been produced by Adam Hinch. You'll hear from Adam in a moment. He'll be able to tell you a bit about that, but I can say, having been associated with these sorts of webinars over a number of years now, Adam's contributions to doing these sorts of global surveys of policy practice and best practice incredibly helpful. It can be hard to understand everything that's going on around the world in novel and emerging policy spaces, and I think sharing those learnings via sort of expert analysis by people like Adam is incredibly helpful for supercharging the sharing of learnings. And certainly I'm looking forward to listening in to Adam's summation of what I know is another really valuable report. And then, of course, from that sort of meta-analysis, we'll have the opportunity to hear from experts from the supranational level, from the perspective of the European Commission, and also from the national level, friends from France, and of course, sharing our own experience here in Australia. I should note as well that both this webinar and also Adam's report made possible through the generous contributions of the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water here in Australia, and is taking part under the auspices of the Building Codes Working Group, which sits within, of course, the IEA's Energy in Buildings and Communities program. So with that, I will introduce Ivana Brown, Head of Operations and Standards at NABERS, to take us through the rest of the session. Thank you, Ivana.
Thanks, Luke. That was a really great introduction to today's session. I don't think I need to introduce any more about the session today following that. I think that was excellent. Just a couple of housekeeping things, which is we have a Q&A. So if you have questions about today, pop them in, and we will get to those questions at the end. So rather than hear from me anymore, I'm actually going to introduce Adam Hinge. Adam Hinge is the Managing Director of the Sustainable Energy Partnerships over in North America. Welcome, Adam.
Thanks very much, Ivana, and very nice to be with all of you. Good evening to a lot of you. It's quite early morning here in New York, where I am based, but I think Luke gave a great introduction summary of kind of the space that we're working in, and there really has been very much a large increase, almost an explosion of policy activity around mandatory whole life or embodied carbon requirements in building regulations. And I was asked about a year ago to try to dig into this and do a bit of a summary of what's happening on mandatory policies. A tremendous amount of voluntary activity, probably 100 times what we cover in the report here, but we've tried to focus in on where were there mandatory requirements. If we can go to the next slide, Nat. There we go. And as Luke and Ivana both just said, this work was commissioned by the Australian Department of Climate Change, Energy and the Environment and Water. And I'll just say a bit more about the Building Energy Codes Working Group. The International Energy Agency has several different technical collaboration programs. A large one that does a lot of work is the IEA's Technology Collaboration Program on Energy in Buildings and Communities. Has a lot of different research annexes that dig very deeply into this. And there have actually been a couple of research annexes, including one that is currently active, Annex 89, related to embodied whole life carbon, that go into some of these issues that I'm covering at a high level in a much more detailed technical view. I just want to give a quick hat tip and thanks to Stanford Harrison, who oversees the commercial buildings policy section and sits on the executive committee of the IEA Energy and Buildings and Communities Group, and very active with the Building Energy Codes Working Group, and then Mitch Tobin, who had been the project manager for this. Next slide. So I think Luke kind of hit this, but we have had a lot of policies over the past several decades working on the operating carbon, what comes from the energy use operating buildings, the resulting emissions from that. And as that amount of operating carbon shrinks, we see that embodied carbon becomes a much bigger piece of the pie. You can see a different pie down below. And I will say all of the slides that I've got here, nearly all of them are figures directly from the report. Nat, I've got the last slide as a link to the full report, but Nat may even want to put that in the chat at some point when this is finishing up. So anyway, you can see in the pie charts, this is from some International Energy Agency data, both on the energy demand by sector from buildings, residential and non-residential, and then the emissions and direct emissions versus indirect. I think some of you know that on scope 1 and scope 2, but you can see down on the bottom, while there's a decent amount that's the operating emissions that comes to the 27%, there's also an additional 10% from the embodied or other parts other than the operational use. If we go to the next. So there's a lot of work on how you break in these life cycle stages and modules. And as Luke had said, traditionally we focus just on operational carbon, the operational down at the bottom, the B6 and B7. These categories, and I suspect there are people who are participating in the meeting who know a lot more about this than I do, but we break things into upfront carbon, the products and construction, A1 through A5, then what happens in the use of the building other than the operational, then end of life. All of those are called embodied, the A, B, and C other than the operational. And when you put the embodied and the operational together, you end up with whole life carbon. This kind of comes from a number of different international and European standards, some of which are in the midst of updating, and we'll talk more about that. Kind of the terminology around whole life versus embodied, we spend some time in the report trying to get into the distinctions of that to be clear. Yet I think a lot of people are focusing on embodied, whereas in Europe, whole life is more of the terminology that's typically used. Next slide. So life cycle emissions will vary by building type. This is just some data from some Danish case studies that led to their limits. And I'll talk about it in just a moment, but the European model has more been set limits. And I think that's some of where Australia seems to be potentially evolving. But this was just a sampling of a bunch of different building types. They kind of had a larger number of case studies, then did some data cleaning. In the report, we also refer to a Canadian study in Ontario that looked at a similar an even wider range of different variation by building type. Next slide. So in the report, and I'm not going to get into it in a whole lot of detail here, in the report, we kind of do, I guess we did a deep dive in trying to understand what the policies were and then summarize each of them into a page or two with, kind of a brief summary of coverage, specific scope requirements, supporting policies and sources for additional information. The mandatory carbon limits at this point, really from a mandatory regulatory perspective, are in place just in Europe. And it's great that we have Louis to speak about the French experience, and then the European Union updated its Energy Performance of Buildings Directive in 2024 and has a real roadmap that I think Bunthan will take us through. We wanted to also look at some other mandatory requirements beyond just the limits, and we highlight in the report the City of London, Vancouver, and then the state of California. Much more detail on all of these in the report. I will say on the mandatory carbon limits, some of you probably already know, but these limits kind of set a cap on the total emissions over a reference study period. The reference study period is usually 50 or 60 years. Next slide. And I'll kind of warn you, the next few are not intended for you to read. It's a bit of a teaser to take a look in the report, but we tried to take all of that information on the deeper dives into the 9 leading jurisdictions and summarize them in a few tables. This one you can see for the mandatory limit policies. We have the same table for the other ones as well, but this kind of just does a quick summary of what they cover, when they got started, and the reference study period, all of that. And then also kind of when is this being regulated at the time of design level, at permit application, or as built, and then what are the floor area definitions. Next slide. This one is the ultimate vision test. I'm not going to try and do it, but this one, we had the I showed the different life cycle modules on the earlier slide. What we tried to do on this, you can see kind of on the left side, the different life cycle stages that are included. For the most part, really all of the policies include the A1 through A3, most of them A1 through A5. In many cases, the operational energy may have been covered in other policies that are in place for a longer period of time. The one other piece I would just mention is you can see over on the right the different ways these groupings are called. You kind of have a cradle to gate for the A1 to A3, the upfront carbon A1 to A5, cradle to grave, and then cradle to cradle. So just so you guys know some of the policies, the expressions for what's included. Next slide. This one, what we tried to do was look at the different building elements that are covered. Again, really the base building, if you will, the substructure, superstructure, enclosure, and then in many cases, some of the interiors, but it varies a lot of what's recovered, what's required, what's optional, in cases where there's required via proxy or estimated values, and then sometimes not required. I will say that a lot of these policies are evolving quickly, and even in Europe, some of them that were proposed a year or two ago and had rules that were going to take effect, particularly in Denmark and Sweden and even Finland. Some of those are changing now because of the European Commission regulation and requirements that Bunthan will talk about in a few minutes. Again, much more detail on all of this. And I will also say that from the European perspective, there's a much more detailed breakdown of the different building elements, but we couldn't get to that level of granularity for the policies outside of Europe. Next slide. Again, we'll talk about it more in the report, but just to kind of point people, there is a lot of international standards activity. Some of the early work was done through the European Commission for Standardization and the CEN standards. And I think one of the foundational standards is the EN 15978 that kind of established the different life cycle stages. That's in the midst of a revision that again, perhaps either Buntan or Louis can speak more to, but then some of those have also been converted into or further developed into international ISO standards that also, many of which are in the midst of some different revisions. Next slide. So one of the things we tried to do when looking at all of the activity was see, for jurisdictions that don't have mandatory policies in place yet, what are some of the key embodied carbon policy design features? And there was an excellent report pulled together last year by the Building Performance Institute Europe that looked at what were the key design features that need to be decided as part of any whole life carbon policy. I think some of this was in development around the time that the European Energy Performance of Buildings directive was being finalized to include whole life carbon. And again, I think Buntan will probably be able to answer questions on how some of that evolved. But for places that don't yet have embodied or whole life carbon policies in place, I really encourage you to take a look at this Building Performance Institute Europe document as a great source of information. Next slide. A similar initiative has been led by a group, the Nordic Sustainable Construction Process, that really was looking at harmonizing some of the different whole life policies that have been developing and evolving in the Scandinavian countries, particularly Denmark, Finland, Sweden, and the Nordic area. And as we were looking at this key steps in developing and implementing policies, we all thought was really a very nice summary. You kind of need to start with building up competence. If you don't have the expertise and awareness of these issues, you're not going to have a lot of luck. But then really a lot of information about getting stakeholder involvement and data. You'll see that in the report, access to data, availability, and digitalization of environmental EPDs, really trying to get people and main stakeholders familiar. And I think this is where Louis will be able to speak to kind of how things have evolved and gave us some great information about how the French process has evolved over the years. Next slide. I'm going to just really, without reading all of this, point you toward the conclusions of the report. It's relatively early days. The Europeans are really way out in front on this. I think we heard from several of the European leading jurisdictions that they are seeing a lot better data collection and consistency in reporting, though it's somewhat early to understand whether we're seeing drastic changes to construction practices yet. There's a lot of variation. I think, again, you can see from the summary tables, the coverage of things, how that varies a bit. A lot of need for better data availability, transparency, and calculation methodologies, and the ability to directly compare results. But I think if I will call it the experiment and the process that's going forward in Europe to try and do some level of harmonization and coordination of all of the member states in Europe is going to be a really interesting demonstration over the next couple of years, and then we'll tell us more about that. More international coordination. I think Europe has a tremendous amount of activity going on. I'm not sure that there's quite as much collaboration other than some kind of technical policy geeks that's happening in terms of policy development on this. Next slide. Real just high level conclusions. What we've been seeing, building the capacity of regulators in the construction industry before implementing any mandatory requirements. Tremendous amount of early engagement with building owners, designers, and other key stakeholders, and then starting smaller, trying to begin any mandatory policies with a smaller number of perhaps large buildings and reasonably achievable limits. If you're looking at limit values, can help build the industry experience. And then last slide. So here's a link to the full report. Maybe we can paste that in the chat as well if people want to look. And I've got my email address here. And I think with that, I'll turn it back over to Ivana.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, that was really interesting. I know you mentioned how quickly these policies are changing and evolving, and I think you can definitely see that in your research. And I know when NABERS started looking at developing an embodied carbon tool just a couple of years ago, like at that time, it almost felt too early, and it was like 12 months later that it was too late. So yeah, it's really interesting to see a lot of that also like reflected in your research as well. If you have any questions about Adam's the report or Adam's presentation, pop them in the Q&A. We'll get to them at the end. Next, I wanted to introduce Banthan Ia. He works as a policy officer at the Director General for the Energy of the European Commission. And Banthan will talk about some of the requirements in the European Energy Performance of Buildings Directive for life cycle global warming potential and the roadmap ahead. Welcome, Banthan.
Thank you so much, Ivana. I hope everybody can hear me well. Yes, so my name is Banthan. I work in the DGNR, and I'm in charge of these topics of life cycle global warming potential at the commissions at the unit B3 of the DG Energy. Next slide, please. So for those, I mean, in Europe, we kind of familiar with this directive, at least for those people who are working in the buildings or in the construction environment, I might say, but probably not much outside of Europe. And this energy performance buildings directive has been there in Europe for many years. And as the name suggests, the idea of this directive is to have a minimum requirements of buildings' energy performance. The idea is to reduce the energy consumption, to increase the energy efficiency in buildings. And this directive has been introduced for many years and have been revised and amended for a couple of times. And the latest versions of this directive was adopted in 2024 EPBD CAS, and one of the significant change that we can find in these latest revisions is the introductions of what Adam just mentioned earlier, the life cycle global warming potential calculations of new buildings. Next slide, please. And the idea of the introductions of these new provisions is, first of all, the directive recognized the facts that the buildings during its whole life cycle, from the constructions, the use, and to the end of life, it has the emissions during its whole life cycle, not only during the phase where it is used, which is more related to the energy and which is already been cycled for many years already in the directive, but they begins to consider also the other parts of the emissions of the buildings, including the productions of the materials, the constructions of the buildings, and of course, when the building is demolished and at the end of life. I think I haven't put a slide in here, just showing a number of some figures, but we have since in a couple of studies in Europe, for example, when we look at the emissions of the building stocks, of course, you're going to find, for example, for certain years, the big bulk of the emissions, we're talking about 80% more or less, which is related to the operational emissions, while about 10% and more are related to the embodied emissions, which is of course less than the part which is related to the operational emissions. But we have to understand where they are coming from. In Europe, for example, which is one of the regions in the world where we build less and less new constructions compared to the existing building stock. Those 10% or more of the emissions of the building stocks are coming actually from less than 1% of the part of the building, which is significant and huge, and which demonstrate the fact that if we can somehow tackle these issues of life cycle emissions of new buildings, we can have a big impact in terms of result. The directive highlight also the fact that the buildings are also not just a place where we live and where we work, but also a significant material banks for the same reason that I just told you. And the buildings, when we build, is supposed to last for years, decades. So the choice that we make during the conceptions of the building, the design of the building, the choice of the material is very important and have a huge impact on how the emissions of the building is going to take place during its whole life cycle. And what the directive has set out is that to take into account this whole life emissions of the buildings from the beginning until the ends. And we're going to start with new buildings. Next slide, please. And when you look at these latest versions of the directive, there is two main provisions related to the life cycle global warming potential calculations and limits value. So the first one is in Article 1.2, when the member states are required to ensure that the calculation is done for new buildings, for large new buildings, sorry, from 2028, and for all building from 2030. That is the one on one hand. On the other hand, the directive also require the member states to publish and notify the national roadmap detailing how they're going to use the limits value on this life cycle global warming potential starting from 2030. And the directive is adopted. We are now in the phase of the implementations of this directive. And at the Commission side, we are working on a couple of documents, I might say. First of all, according to the Articles 1.3, the Commission is empowered to adopt a delegated act to set out a unified or union framework for the calculations at the European level. The idea here is that we have to see the fact and the situation nowadays is we have, as Adam mentioned in his presentation, a couple of countries who are the front runner and already have implemented their regulations for years already, and not necessarily identical approach, I might say. And the idea here is to beginning from now, starting to implement a number of harmonized frameworks so that we don't continue to diverge, but starting to progressively converge to a common approach. That is the idea of this delegated act, and the Commission is working on it right now, and it's supposed to be adopted before the end of this year. On the other hand, we are also working on a guidance to help the member state to produce their national roadmaps, and the idea here is to help to support the member states on some technical and recommendations, and for them to especially those who don't have the regulation yet, to understand how they're going to use this regulation in the national legislative. Next slide, please. And here is a quick summary of the timeframes. We have the adoptions of the directive in May 2024. The Commission has to adopt this secondary text, this delegated act, before the end of the year to set out a union framework for calculations. By 2027, the member state has to publish their national roadmap detailing how they're going to introduce the limits value according to the Article 7.5. And by 2028, the member states, the calculations for large building, so we are talking about over 1,000 meters square, is mandatory. The calculation for all building is mandatory from 2030. And the limits value that the member states has set out in 2027's national roadmap has to be in place by that time as well. Next slide, please. And that is what we have been done so far until now. We have a couple of stakeholder meetings to engage with the stakeholders, to engage especially with the member state as well, because they are the one who are responsible for the implementations of this directive. And we are now in the final stage of, I might say, adjustment and discussions for the delegated act. So the framework for the calculations, the Commission is planning to launch it for a public consultation, probably, hopefully before summer. And the idea here is to have it adopted as required by the directive before December 2025. regarding the recommendation or the guidance for the national roadmaps, it is in the final stage of the validations, and hopefully it can be adopted before by in a couple of weeks or a bit more, hopefully before summer as well. Next slide, please. And I'm going to touch a couple of notions on the delegated regulations, delegated act for the union framework for the calculations. Next slide, please. Which is it's like which is related to the first part, which is the Article 7.2. Next slide, please. So in the current versions of the directive, we already have the Annex 3 setting out a number of specifications on how to do the calculations. Annex 3 specifies, for example, that the calculation has to be a total life cycle GWP, global warming potential calculations. It has to be done for each life cycle stage. It gives some specification as well related to the units, for example, kilo CO2 equivalents per meter square. The study periods is specified quite clearly here. It's about 50 years, which is coherent with what we have been done so far in some of the European countries, and also in the voluntary European framework, such as levels. There's some specification as well regarding the scope of buildings elements has to be inspired or in line with the levels common European framework right now. And of course, one of the most important aspect, which is the data to be used for the calculation at the European level, in parallel to this energy performance building directive. We also have the construction product regulations, which are going to require that the buildings products has to declare the environmental products. So when the data are available under such a regulation, it has to be used for this calculation at the building level. Next slide, please. So the idea of this delegated act or delegated regulation is not to reinvent everything. More or less, we are going to follow the logics already set out in this Annex 3, giving a couple of consideration, for example, on the general frameworks. One of the standards that Adams mentioned earlier regarding how to do the calculations and the EN 15978 seems to be one of the solutions that is going to be adopted at the European side, at least, because it's already widely used in a number of front-runner member states, and also in line with levels as well. In this delegated regulation, we're going to specify or clarify also a number of other aspects, such as the scope of life cycle stage to be required for the calculation, the scope of buildings components, the reference studies periods more or less confirm what is already set out in the Annex 3, when to do the calculations, and the data to be used for the calculations, some notions on the useful flow areas, because when we talking about the units earlier, the GWP is to be reported kilo CO2 per meter square, and the idea here is what is the meter square, and finally the reporting format of the result. Next slide, please.
Banthan, I know you've got a couple more things that you want
Yes.
to go through, so I just want to make sure you get through all the important bits
Yep.
in your time.
I'm going to finish in a minute. Yes.
Awesome. Yeah.
This slide is not very important, just to point out that the main objective of this directive is for the calculation at the buildings level, and the data declaration at the products level is the competence of the construction product regulation. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. This is for the guidance which related to Article 7.5. Next slide, please. And yes, and the idea here is the member state has to do this national roadmap, and from the Commission side, we're going to issue this guidance to help to support the member states. And what I can tell you is that the member states are required to set out the limits value with a progressive downward trend from 2030, and if it's relevant, they have to distinguish this limits value according to the climate zone and building typologies. Next slide, please. And what is going to find out in the final outcomes of this guidance is more or less a recommendation, a recommended process, step by step for the member state, especially those who doesn't have the regulation yet from the beginning until the moment that they can have their regulation. Next slide, please. Yes, and I think that's the end on my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Banthan. That was really great to see. It's really great to see the work that the European Commission is doing to create a harmonised approach to tackling whole-of-life carbon in buildings. I know our experience here in Australia is like for operational emissions in commercial buildings, having a harmonised approach has had a huge impact in terms of accelerating progress. Next, I wanted to introduce Louis Brou, who is the Director of the Low Carbon Building Projects at the French Public Agency of CEREMA. Louis will talk about the French carbon regulations and some feedback that they've received after 3 years of application. Over to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to talk about the RE 2020, the French environmental regulations applying to new buildings based on life cycle assessment. So I'm working at CEREMA, a French public agency developing public expertise in the fields of ecological and energy transition. Next slide, please. Oh, next two. Yes, you can pass. Yeah, okay. Over the past 8 years, I've accompanied the development of these new regulations with the French government. So since 2022, these regulations apply to new housing, office, and educational buildings. So we now have 3 years feedback on its applications. This regulation is based on 3 pillars, you can see here, energy, carbon, and summer comfort. But we will focus here on the whole life carbon aspect. We define 6 key performance indicators that I will let you read later, because we will focus on the blue ones, IC energy and IC consumption, which are carbon impact relative to energy consumption during 50 years of life in the buildings. And for IC construction, this is the impact of equipments, materials, and construction during the building life cycle. Next slide, please. So how do we rate IC energy, the carbon impact relative to energy? That's simple. We simulate the energy consumption and we convert it to emissions using conventional carbon coefficients defined by the government for each energy sources. We have a demanding threshold that has progressively limited the use of gas heating and the use of electric radiant panels. The RE 2020 encouraged the use of heat pumps, wood-fired boilers, and central heat networks. Next slide, please. How do we rate the building impact? IC construction. We assess the building's entire life cycle on a 50 years study period, including all stages from A to D, as it was explained by Adam. Next slide, please. So where do we find the product data? We find it in the French mandatory database called IEA. The declarations are made on a voluntary basis by the manufacturers and verified by an independent third party. We have more than 4,000 product declarations and 1,500 equipment declarations. In case of lack of data, the government has built default data you can use, but which have an increasing impact compared to the other manufacturers' data. Next slide, please. So what is the limit value for buildings' carbon impact? The government defined an increasing requirement over time that will decrease by 35% between 2022 and 2031 in order to follow the French carbon neutral strategy. All these thresholds are expressed in for 50 years of life cycle. This reinforcement encourage, like as you can see, biosourced materials such as wood, hemp, or straw, because they can store carbon during their growth and then keep it inside building during 50 years. And the IEA 2020 will curb the use of steel, concrete, which emits CO2 during the manufacturing process. Also, the French government decided to add a new calcul rule in the IEA 2020 LCA to take into account the temporal dynamics of storage and emission. We called it dynamic LCA. The greenhouse gas emitted today carries more weight than carbon emitted later, for example, in 50 years. So we apply a corrective coefficient to the emissions, evolving from 1 today to 0.57 in 50 years. Next slide, please. What about the other buildings? After 2 years of work and simulations to define thresholds, the regulations will come into force in 2026 for all the other buildings types you can see listed here. So we will have a limit value for libraries, hotels, restaurants, shops, air terminals, industry, and all the other buildings you can see here. Because it was a long work, but now we have found limit values that can fit our carbon neutral strategy. Next slide, please. Since 1 year, we have the professionals have free access to a national database containing the performance of all projects since IEA 2020 came into force. You have the performance at the permit level and the performance of buildings constructed. This is an invaluable tool to know the construction trends evolution and to know the margins that projects have over these thresholds. Next slide, please. So I can talk to you about some lessons from the first 3 years of application. We have found that design offices and architects have now mastered the LCA and are learning to use it in the design process. The environmental product declarations have been refined and multiplied with less impact than in 2022, thanks to process optimizations. And what do we learn about built with less carbon? We have realized that levers in building design and layout can have a major impact on carbon weight, especially if you want to continue building with concrete structure. For example, in apartment buildings, we can't reach our 2028 limit value with a non-optimized floor plan and non-optimized compactness, because it's necessary to limit the surface area of poured concrete if you want to limit carbon. We have found that the front lot is not the one of that weighs the most, but it's the most valuable. It can range from 50 to 250 kilograms CO2 by square meters. The level of glazing in facades has an impact on carbon weight too, as windows weigh more than walls, even if a certain amount of natural light must be preserved. You can also try to avoid underground parkings, because if you have less underground parkings, you have less concrete. We encourage to use reused materials. You can save up to 20 kilograms CO2 by square meters, CO2, excuse me. And we have learned that the IES database, in the IES database, we see the emergence of healthy competition between different product ranges, enabling us to find the product with the lowest carbon impact on certain building elements. Thank you.
Thanks, Louis. Yeah, I hadn't actually heard about the concept of dynamic LCA before, so that was new for me. And yeah, it's really promising to see the French experience and how quickly industry is mastering life cycle assessments in such a short period of time. I think that's great. Next, I wanted to invite Katie Isles. She is the Embodied Carbon lead at the National Australian Built Environment Rating System, or as we like to refer to it as NABERS, same place that I am. Katie's here to talk about the NABERS Embodied Carbon tool and the rating system. And yeah, don't forget to add your questions into the Q&A because we'll be getting to those shortly. Over to you, Katie.
Great, thanks, Ivana. Yeah, we can skip this slide. So I'll do a little intro to NABERS first so that you can understand what NABERS is, what we do if you're not in Australia. So NABERS rates the environmental performance of buildings on a 6-star rating scale, which is, you know, really easy to understand where you sit compared to the rest of the market. It's really easy to make a target for a certain star value. Next slide, thanks. And when we create that star rating system, the algorithm behind that is based on data from real buildings, from a lot of buildings, and we make corrections for things that affect the ones on the screen here. You're seeing, for example, other things that affect embodied carbon in a building. So we correct for things like area, building type, building height, and parking area, because they all have an impact on how much embodied carbon there'll be in a building. Next slide, thanks. So yeah, we don't just certify buildings on embodied carbon. We started out with operational energy, and we have a bunch of different rating types for most building types that are not standalone houses. Next slide, thanks. And because some NABERS ratings are mandated by the government, we're kind of all over the place, really. You can see just some examples here from big cities in Australia, the number of ratings that we have. These aren't embodied carbon ratings yet, you know, hopefully soon, but these are operational energy ratings mostly at the moment. Next slide, thanks. So yeah, we started developing the Embodied Carbon rating tool back in 2021. And the way that we went about it was working really closely with industry. So we've spent a few years engaging with everyone who's involved in developing buildings, from, you know, owners and developers and engineers right through to policymakers and building product manufacturers. And what we've been doing with everyone is figuring out, okay, well, if we're going to create an embodied carbon rating system, how do we do that? What's involved? So answering things like, what life cycle phases are we trying to include in the rating? What is the scope of what we're measuring in terms of materials? You know, are we going down to the fit out and measuring absolutely everything, or should we be more focused on the materials that make more of an impact, like the concrete, aluminium, steel, that sort of thing? So yeah, we've been working closely with industry to make decisions about all of those things and make sure that everyone around Australia agrees that what we're creating is useful, appropriate, and usable. Next slide, thanks. And yeah, we have finished creating the tool now. It's ready and live for people to use. And basically what the Embodied Carbon tool is these 5 things. So first of all, rules, a set of rules that standardize what you're measuring, how you measure it, what emission factors to use, all of those sorts of things, so that everyone is doing a rating, an embodied carbon rating consistently. Secondly, they're emissions, so defining what emission factors to use for materials, and we also have developed a national database of default emission factors to use if you have a product in your building that doesn't have an EPD or another appropriate measured emission factor. Thirdly, training. So all of the embodied carbon ratings that happen in Australia, they are done by accredited assessors. We train those assessors and they pass an exam. And the purpose of that is to make sure that everyone is following the rules consistently. Then we have certification. NABERS, we receive a rating from an assessor and we audit that rating to make sure that it is done in line with the rules, to make sure that the evidence is right, to make sure that when you see a NABERS embodied carbon rating, you can trust that the information and the rating itself is accurate. And then finally, the benchmarking, so that 6-star system, so that you can easily see at a glance where your building sits compared to the rest of the market in terms of whether it's performing well with low emissions or if there's still work for you to do. Next slide, thanks. So I'll talk through just a few of the kind of main themes of the tool. So this tool measures upfront embodied carbon. We certify upfront embodied carbon A1 to A5. The reason we are focused on upfront carbon is because in Australia, that is the biggest part of the picture for new buildings. Around 65 to 75% of all embodied carbon is upfront carbon, and we know that urgent action is needed in the next few years. Of course, we don't want to ignore whole of life carbon because, you know, obviously we should be making decisions today that are informed by whole of life considerations. So in the tool, we do have a whole of life calculation that, that you can easily use to kind of check what you're doing and make sure you aren't having any really unfortunate whole of life impacts. But it's just that what we are actually certifying is the upfront embodied carbon, because when the building has been built, you know what's been used. It's very clear and easy to certify that emissions number. And if we were to try and certify whole of life, we'd need to make assumptions about the future, which are likely to be incorrect. And we don't want to be trading off higher emissions now for things that may or may not happen in the future when we're actually doing the rating. Next slide, thanks. So in terms of measuring upfront carbon, pretty simple in a way: quantity of each material times the emissions of that material, and then we add on transport, construction energy, and emissions from construction waste. Next slide, thanks. But to go into a bit more detail on those things, in terms of scope, what materials we're measuring, we're really focused on the main structure of the building. So substructure, superstructure, envelope, some of the internal items which make a bigger impact, such as stairs, floors, internal walls, and then also building services and vertical transport. We don't include things like fixtures and fittings and fit out materials in the rating because that would be more difficult to do in terms of collecting information and collecting good information about the emissions for those things. And also it would be harder to be very consistent. So in terms of what we're measuring in a rating, we're looking at things that are in control of the developer. So yeah, it makes it a lot easier and more consistent if we're not trying to rate fit out as well. But with the base building that we are rating, we're capturing about 90% of emissions involved in a new building on average. Next slide, thanks. So yeah, to give you an idea of what that looks like, you can download our rules and take a look if you like, but you can see it's pretty consistent across different building types. Just retail and industrial, you can see down at the bottom right there, we don't include internal walls for ratings for those two building types because internal walls can typically be part of the tenant fit out, so not in control of the developer. Next slide, thanks. We're really focused on evidence of what was actually built. So we're talking about things like delivery dockets, returnable schedules, receipts, so that we know when we're doing a rating, we're rating exactly what was delivered to the site, the product and how much of it. Next slide, thanks. Okay, so next for Australia, in terms of deciding what emission factors to use, we have a little bit of a, I think it might be a bit of a unique situation here where we had a database, emission factors database that was very popular, which was hybrid data. When we did consultation with industry, we heard very strong preference from industry for our tool to use process-based product-specific emission factors. So what that means is EPDs or product carbon footprints that are compliant with the same international standards that are used for EPDs or that have an equivalent system boundary to an EPD. Next slide, thanks. So yeah, we know that, of course, all of the products that you're going to put into a building, it's very likely that a fair few of them don't have a measured emission factor, that they don't have an EPD or a carbon footprint. So we developed a set of default emission factors that you can use if you don't have measured data. We developed this really closely with industry, working with product manufacturers and consultants and various people in industry to make sure that we were doing this the right way. In a nutshell, what we did was collect all of the EPDs that are available for all of the building products that can be used in Australia. And if we go to the next slide, we can see what that looks like. Essentially, what we have is a default emission factor for each product type based on the information we collected in all of those EPDs. So this is available to download, and you can have a read through the details if you like. But we have a conservative default emission factor to use if you don't have a measured data for your product, and that conservative default is typically speaking the worst emission factor that we found in any EPD in that product group, plus a little bit of a uplift for uncertainty. So you can see for concrete in situ, the one at the top there, we've added 10% on because for that product type there was limited data. For the ones where we had a lot more data, we've only added 2%. Yeah, next slide, thanks. So that emission factors database, we're keeping it updated. It's being updated every year. And of course, because the defaults are conservative, if you use products that have measured emissions, such as an EPD, that will improve your rating. Next slide, thanks. So yeah, I think the last important thing is the NABERS embodied carbon rating system has national agreement here in Australia. We developed it in partnership with the Green Building Council and industry. It's aligned with international standards for measuring embodied carbon. We've worked closely with infrastructure to make sure that buildings and infrastructure, we're both approaching this in the same way to make things really easy and consistent for everyone. And it is already in policy in a few places. I think probably the biggest example there is this will be a voluntary pathway to meet the requirements in the next update to our National Construction Code, which is coming fairly soon. Next slide, thanks. So yeah, there's just a couple of links to download the emission factors database, the rules, or the calculator itself if you'd like to take a look at that. And I'll hand back to Ivana for, I think, question time.
That's right. Thanks, Katie. Yeah, I've seen firsthand all the work that's gone into developing this tool and how important it is to get Australia's building sector sort of moving in the same direction and progressing really quickly. So yeah, it's really great to see all the work you've done. We are going to move on to the Q&A part of the session today. So what you can do is you can pop your questions in the Q&A part of the webinar today, and we will get to those. I have a question that I wanted to start with, if all the panelists could put their cameras on. My first question is, what have been the biggest surprises and most challenging barriers in implementing whole of life carbon and embodied carbon policies? Who would like to go first?
I can answer if you want.
Yeah.
So in France, we have both the energy part and the construction part. For the construction, we had a long discussion on how to encourage biosourced materials, which led us to dynamic LCA, because we have this first trial between 2016 and 2020 called E+C-, and we have found through this trial that the biosourced material were not very very successful in the carbon impact because of the 50 years life cycle. Where we considered that at the end of the life of the material, it was burned or it was emitting CO2. So we have this debate on the dynamic LCA, and we also have a difference between the revolution represented by the integration of LCA and the modesty of the first performance limit value imposed. So professionals were saying to themselves, these calculations are going to be complicated. And then, in fact, they found that it won't change the thing.
That's great. Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Bunthan, was there anything that you found surprising or particularly challenging in your work?
Yes, thank you so much. At the Commission side, I mean, we are still in the phase of drafting all of this framework, so it is not, officially implementing yet. But from what we have heard, because during this phase of consultation, we try to reach out also to, especially the member states who have already, their regulation in place for a couple of years already. And one thing that I kind of learned from these aspects that even though it is kind of, a intuitive approach doing the calculation, as mentioned by Katie earlier, is more or less you have the amount, you have the unit, the emission per unit, and then you do the calculation. But from the member state side, it can need some times of variations. The experience in France mentioned by Louise, it can be, I don't know, 10 years, something like that. And when we look at the other member states, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, the number is not that far, I might say. And so I think one of the challenge that we recognize at the European side, at least, we understand that it may need some preparations, and things may be not entirely perfect at for short. We have to understand that. But we are hopefully trying to learn, at least at the European, because we are also very close from one to the other. So the idea here is to learn from the existing experience, from what is have been developed already among the member states, and try not to reinvent the wheel each time. And I think we will be able to deliver it at a respectable time. But one thing that I want to underline a little bit is the fact that when we talk about this topic, I mean, in some member states, they have been discussed about it for many years, but things still like blank paper today. Why? Because each time we talk about this, we don't have data, we don't have people to do the calculation, we don't have tools to do the calculation. For example, we don't know how to verify the calculation. But each time when we, coming up with this question and we don't start to build something else, it's become a cycle of nothing or no action, I might say, because some of the aspects, as we also show in his slide, the fact that in France, you can see the number of EPD increase almost exponentially. One of the main reasons is because they have the RE 2020 as well. So some of those questions also result by the fact that we start building some things, and the momentum can build by that way as well. That's what I want to highlight.
I'll just add a little bit on top of what Bunthan just said. I think the one piece I saw in talking with a lot of experts and some of the country experts where policies have been in place, because things are moving so quickly, there's been a bit of I don't know if I would say disruption, but the Nordic countries that were moving so quickly ahead, I think, are now kind of slowing down a bit, just to make sure that they're consistent with how the broader European framework goes. And in Sweden, for example, some limits that were originally scheduled to take effect in July in just a few days have now been postponed a bit, to kind of work in with the broader roadmap framework that the Commission has directed.
Thanks, Adam. Katie, I can see you nodding along. Did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to say a bit similar to Bunthan, which is, yeah, the implementation is really hard in the sense of to measure embodied carbon in all these buildings, there needs to be a lot of professionals that understand how to actually do it, and the amount of details involved from understanding what the building products are themselves. You know, there's a lot of people that understand that, but then they don't understand everything involved in emissions and biogenic carbon and all transport emissions and all those sorts of things. And the people that know that don't understand building products, and getting people who can, yeah, training up industry so that they understand enough of all of those things to actually be doing these measurements is very challenging.
I think that's probably a nice segue to one of the questions that we've got in the Q&A, which is from an anonymous attendee. But how has the industry responded to the mandatory carbon requirements, and how can the policies be developed and rolled out in a manner that they will be accepted by all stakeholders? Who would like to go first? Adam, did you see any of that in your research?
I was just say, I'll throw in a quick one of something I heard from a few of the people in the Nordic countries that I will say is very different from what I see in North America here. That you know, a few years ago, all of this was new and kind of foreign to most participants in the Nordic countries. And one thing I heard repeatedly, everyone in the construction industry knows what an environmental product declaration, an EPD, is at this point. And I think we have a long way to go on that in much of the rest of the world outside. And probably Bunthan can perhaps talk to this, but you know, some of the other European countries that aren't quite as far along. That was the one piece I heard consistently in talking to folks.
Yep, Bunthan, did you want to add to that?
Yes, when I mean, of course, when we try to implement this all and can make a lot of change and needs a lot of action, I may say, and it would be like false if you say that everybody like on the same line, I might say. But to be perfectly honest with you, when we're talking about the EPD or the life cycle assessment, the main components that we're going to look for is where is the data. And I think we are quite lucky in the European level that we have also in this, on parallel, the CPO, the construction product regulation, which require that all of the product manufacturer has to declare this EPD in for their products in order to be able to put it in the European markets. And from what I heard until now, and to be honest with you, all of the industry ask for this harmonization because they don't want to declare it's only for France. They don't want to declare it only for Germany. They want to declare once and for all European countries. And every industry that I have discussed with, all of them are happy to have this harmonized way of doing it. Now we are talking in Europeans, but well, I'm too idealized. But in the future, if you have a more international system, it's even better, I may say. And that is like what we're talking about, like manufacturer focus and products level. And when we're talking about the calculation at the buildings level, I think it's not the question about the manufacturer once they have done their job, I might say, under the construction product regulations. The calculation at the buildings level would only make more sense of the effort that they have put for the product data declarations under the CVO, because one thing that I've learned from the discussion with the industry as well is they don't really keen on having one product to be compared to the other at the products level, because understandably, each product have many dimensions of performance, I might say, fire, stability, mechanical or stuff, many other stuff. So what is important is at the end, we want to show or we want to promote or encourage the best solution at the end, responding to the same performance at the buildings level. And the calculation at the buildings level is, and at least from my point of view, is one of the best way or the best way that we have right now to compare or to highlight which is the best solutions that we have in the market. So a same level playing field for everyone and promote the best solutions. And if I go a little bit over this question, for example, regarding the building designer, the architect, well, some of them who are still like new of the building design and the life cycle concept, they may say that, well, I don't have any idea yet because I'm not really sure how they do that. But those who are familiar with it, it is a new way or a new sense of the design of buildings, and it is at the same time challenging, but I find a lot of the architect association and federations are very favorable of having this new approach and really make the creativity in a new dimension, I may say.
Yes, and Louis, I know that you mentioned in France there was a bit of resistance at the beginning, but that seems to have been washed away with very quick adoption. So what's your experience, and how could you have made your policies be more accepted more quickly potentially?
I think the key is time. It has been very progressive in France. Our database, IES, has 20 years this year. It's a 20th anniversary. So a lot of industry developed environmental product declarations between 2005 and today, and they had time to make this declaration. And then in ERA 2022 we operate like in other countries on the basis of results and not on results and means at the building level. So you can choose to continue to use concrete if you optimize the plan or the compactness of your building. You can manage to succeed in the respect of the limit values. But time is the key, I think. And then yes, last point. When the enterprise make an EPD, they then do eco-conception, so eco-design, and it sometimes went end-to-end with financial savings when they go to limit the CO2 emissions at all stages of their process. Sometimes they save money too.
And Katie, I know you're working hard on developing a voluntary tool for measuring, and then the policy will come later. What's your experience in getting stakeholders on board?
Yeah, I think the overwhelming thing that we heard was just people want consistency. They know they need to measure embodied carbon. They're already starting to do it, so they just need to know how to do it. And rather than waste time or money or effort measuring in a way that might not be right. So yeah, that was the biggest thing for us.
Louis, there's a question for you about the French product declarations. Do they align with the EPD system?
Yes, the answer is yes. We just have an additive thing. It's the LC declaration to know if the product is good or not for the health. But it's like an EPD with just a complement on health.
Another question from the audience from Anthony Wright. Hi, Anthony. Has there been an evaluation of the impact of building embodied carbon disclosures or regulations anywhere? And has there been a measurable reduction in emissions, change in building practices, or any unintended consequences? Or is it still too early to know?
I'll just kind of quickly answer that and say I asked that question a bunch of times of the various experts in preparing the report, and I hadn't heard of any evaluations yet. So I think the most advanced work that was done is in the Nordic countries, the Nordic carbonization effort that we refer to in the report. But I welcome what other panelists might have.
Has anyone else seen anything around evaluations, or is it too early?
Yeah, from my side, I mean, I don't know if there is a precise study impacts of the whole regulation per se, I might say, but I think for just a couple of weeks or days ago, I'm not sure. There's a study that is also been done for the Denmark, and I'm not sure whether it's the one that Adam mentioned, referred to, or something else. But in that study, they have considered a number of case study and look at, for example, when Denmark going from the limits value in 2023, I suppose, to the one in 2025, how much it will cost in addition in terms of finance budget. And yeah, it's a pretty good study. And one of the main message or main takeaway that I can say is that a lot of buildings, well, there's some additional costs. I think between 0 and 2%, something like that, or 3%, which is not much if you're talking about the cost of the constructions. And especially in Europe, another half of the cost is not the building itself, but the land. So it's very limited, I might say. And considering a very ambitious limits value that we can already see in Denmark, that is like one of the study that I have in mind right now. Regarding the change of practice, I think Luis, maybe he has a more clear vision of what is done in France, but at least I think just doing the calculations and make people understand of where is the emissions come from and where is the effort can be done. I think that is one of the main milestones that we have done already. And even if at the beginnings we are starting, or you going to starting with something less ambitious in terms of limits for you, I think it is also reasonable for people to adapt during its transition periods, or learn to do the calculation, and progressively we can tighten it progressively.
Thanks, Banthan. Yeah, one of our favorite taglines here at NABERS is "What gets measured gets managed." So yeah. I've got another question from Albert Desi. I'll throw this one to you first, Katie. Are there particular issues with embodied carbon ratings for very tall buildings where steel and concrete may be the preferred materials traditionally? I know you've done a lot of work in benchmarking different types of buildings.
Yeah, so the way that we do our benchmarking is we collect data for a lot of buildings and then basically just run the numbers and see what we find. For embodied carbon, that was fairly close to 200 buildings that we ran the data for. We do have a correction for height in the algorithm because taller buildings have more structural materials in them. We do correct for height, but I don't think that that's I mean, depending on what you need to build in a certain space, like in the middle of the city center, obviously you're going to be building a taller building because, space is at a premium. So I'm not sure if it means anything necessarily in terms of what people could or should build, because it's all very contextual for a project. But yeah, we do correct for it.
Thanks, Katie. Does anybody else have any particular issues around high-rise buildings that they wanted to add to that?
Just maybe just to highlight a bit on this, in the directive, we have a very clear mentions of the fact that the member states are allowed to adopt the limits value in accordance with the climatic zone or building typologies. And if the member state consider that for some building typologies, for example, high-rise one, they need a more relaxed limits value, this is perfectly allowed according to the directive.
Thanks, Banthan. I've a question to Louis about the French experience. The idea of partially dynamic LCA is fairly advanced and groundbreaking. in the LCA context. What are the main challenges faced during its introduction in the French framework and from a policy perspective? Do you think the benefits of this type of calculation prevail the challenges or vice versa?
As I said from the beginning, it was a little bit hard for concrete and steel and industry to accept this partially dynamic LCA, but then they accept it. They learn to improve their declarations, their own declarations. So they made a lot of progress during the past 3 years on declarations. They have it challenged them this the dynamic LCA, because they try to present a better product for concrete or steel, and they created softwares to generate specific declarations that fit the reality of your project. And we have more biosourced buildings, but we will see more the effect from now, because we have a new limit value in 2025 that came into force. So with this new limit, and in 2028 and then 2031, we will see more challenge for this industry. But I think it's now accepted, this dynamic LCA.
Oh, that's great. Adam, did you see much dynamic LCA in your research?
No, I think the French experience was really the most advanced that I'd seen. There seemed to be interest in it, and we do in the report touch a little bit about kind of the time value of carbon, and there's some other quite interesting work that's been done on that, looking at kind of what can be done to motivate earlier action. But I think the French is the first system that's implemented that, unless Bontan knows of anything beyond that.
Great. Another question from me, which is how are we addressing the challenge of data availability and the quality in calculating whole of life carbon or embodied carbon? Data is a big challenge, so what can we do? Adam, did you want to start on that one?
I think there have been a couple of really useful initiatives that have started in Europe, and now I think with the new work on the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive and the much more sophisticated systems that Buntan spoke about, that will begin to be harmonized more. I think the challenge is, and I even see it a bit with what Katie presented, you have a system that will be developed and used in Australia. There are a lot of independent systems so far. There's like EPD International, I think, kind of got started in Sweden, if I remember right. One Click LCA was a Finnish initiative originally, and those have both grown and expanded a lot, but there are a lot of different sources. I think pragmatically and realistically, getting to kind of consistency beyond individual countries is probably going to be a challenge. Although I think because of the complex set of regulations in Europe beyond just the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, but all the construction materials and trading of products across the European member state borders, I think we'll see a lot more harmonization there. It seems like there's a long way to go. I mean, and maybe Katie or Louis can speak to this as well. I don't know how much the NABERS system will translate directly into buildings outside of Australia. I know NABERS does energy ratings and some other ratings, in other countries, but you've developed that database based on Australian products and Australian industry. I think that's what has been the case in most of the systems so far. But again, I think the experiment that's happening in Europe over the next couple of years will go a long way to more consistency and comparability, at least within Europe. I think realistically, there's a long way to go to have that internationally. Curious on other perspectives.
Yeah, it's tricky because I guess there's a whole heap of different scope questions that you have to take into account, from, you know, what part of the life cycle you're measuring to what are the scope of the emissions that you're, I mean, I guess everyone's agreed on the scope of the emissions. It's the EPD style. Yeah, I think in terms of the emissions, or we found anyway, it really needs to be local in context, because those are the products that are being used in Australia. So that's what we need to base our numbers on. Yeah, in terms of helping get more product measurements, we found industry associations to be really helpful in that regard, to doing things like industry average EPDs. We're getting quite a lot of momentum on that front. Yeah.
Banthan, Louis,
Yes, but it's one of the keys, availability of auditors and specialized engineers to to produce these data too, because at the beginning of the era 2020, we had not enough engineers to make all the product declarations, because there were great demand too. There is a cost too. But the French government give financial help to some industry to develop new declarations too. If there was there was a lack of declarations for a specific element, they can have help to develop it for a wide range of different products. And it was one another key of developing declarations.
Yeah, I'll never say no to more engineers as an engineer. I think that's always the solution to every problem. Banthan, how about in the EU? What are you guys doing to address the challenge of data availability?
Yeah, I think that's, as Adam mentioned earlier, the fact that we have this construction product regulation in parallel is a very nice situation, I might say. Progressively, everybody going to declare the emissions of their products in the same system. But at the same time, we have to also be realistic. Everything is not going to be there from today until tomorrow. Industry needs time to produce their data, and in order to produce their data, they need to have rules for, well, the overarching rule, but also specific rule for products family, and those need time to develop. And we have understanding perfectly the situation. So the calculation at the buildings level, even by 2028. I'm personally not sure that we are going to have 100% data from the CPO, and it's very understandable. They need time to discuss, to debate on a number of aspects at the products level, and I think so. For me, I think the questions of data, it is a very important one. We shouldn't underestimate it, but at the same time, don't overestimate it as well. I mean, there's a lot of way we can do the calculations without specific data at the products level, especially using, for example, default value or generic data. In Europe, we have a number of countries, for example, France, who have been doing the calculation at the buildings level for 3 years at least already. So I feel quite comfortable and optimistic that we have, at least for French case, enough default value data. And the idea here is also to inspire from, and not only France, Denmark, Netherlands for many years have done also the calculations, many other Nordic countries as well. And the idea here is to inspire those from those existing default or generic data to fill the data gap, and also to simplify. In some cases, it doesn't make sense also to ask people to do a very detailed calculation for a very small impact. So yeah, the idea here is in the transition period, use default and generic data, and progressively we take into account the specific data that is made available under the CPO.
Yeah, I think those are wise words. We're coming to the end of our panel session today. So I just want to thank our panelists, Adam, Katie, Bunthan, Louis, for your sharing your insights into and what's happening in your local areas. I hope everybody today has had an opportunity to learn a little bit more about what's happening around the world. And I want to thank the EDC for hosting the event today. There will be an email coming out next week. It will have a recording, and I think there is a link to Adam's report in the chat for everybody. So if you would like to see that, you can click on that link. And yeah, thank you everybody so much for your time today. Yeah, it's been really interesting and fascinating to hear about what's going on locally and internationally. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ivana.